In 1995, Richard Hooper was arrested and convicted for the brutal murder of his wife, Carolyn. The evidence against him seemed irrefutable, the case airtight. A small town watched in disbelief as Richard was sentenced to life in prison, his fate sealed. But Richard never stopped insisting that he was innocent. For 6 long years, he sat in a cell, fighting to prove his innocence, all while the memory of his wife's death haunted him. But then, in a twist that no one could have predicted, the very conviction that locked him away was overturned. Richard was released, his name cleared, but the scars of the past were far from healed. Just when Richard thought he could move on from the nightmare that had consumed his life, something unimaginable happened. A knock at his door. Standing before him was Carolyn. Alive. After years of being presumed dead, she was back. The woman Richard had been accused of murdering, the woman he had buried in his mind, was standing right there in front of him. The question that loomed was simple, yet impossible to answer: what happened to Carolyn Hooper? And more chillingly, why had she disappeared in the first place? Richard's quiet life, his hard-earned peace, would soon unravel as the truth behind Carolyn's disappearance, and his wrongful conviction, began to surface. This is the story of Richard Hooper, the crime that shattered a man's life, and the shocking twist that turned everything upside down, a mystery that not even the best detectives could have foreseen. Richard and Carolyn Hooper had always been seen as the perfect couple. They lived in a quiet, picturesque town in Southern Virginia, where everyone knew each other's names. Their home was modest but well kept, nestled on a tree-lined street where the sound of children playing echoed through the neighborhood. Richard worked as an accountant, a steady job that allowed him to provide for his family, while Carolyn had recently retired from her job as a schoolteacher. They had been married for nearly 20 years, and by all accounts, their life together seemed as normal and content as any. Richard was known for his unwavering devotion to Carolyn. He would talk about her with a tenderness that spoke volumes about the bond they shared. Neighbors often saw him carrying groceries for her, fixing things around the house, or simply holding her hand as they walked through town. To those who knew them, they were the picture of a loving, stable couple. But as with many seemingly perfect lives, things were not always what they seemed. On the night of September 15, 1995, everything changed. Carolyn vanished without a trace. Her car was found parked in the driveway, the front door left ajar as though she had been interrupted. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication of forced entry, just a haunting silence that filled the house. Richard, frantic and desperate, called the police. He told them that he had gone to bed the night before, and when he woke up, Carolyn was gone. At first, it was assumed she had simply left, maybe to clear her head, or perhaps to visit a friend. But as the hours stretched into days, hope dwindled. 2 weeks later, Carolyn's body was discovered in a remote part of the woods, miles away from their home. The discovery sent shockwaves through the town. She had been brutally murdered, her body left in a way that suggested she had fought for her life. The police immediately began their investigation, but they were faced with a baffling situation. No one had seen anything unusual. Neighbors reported hearing nothing. There were no witnesses. The only clues were the vague traces of Carolyn's final moments, and the discovery of a bloody footprint near the scene. Richard's reaction was one of disbelief. In the days that followed the discovery, he expressed nothing but sorrow and confusion. He seemed genuinely shocked, unable to fathom who could have done such a thing to his beloved wife. But as investigators pieced together the evidence, Richard quickly became the prime suspect. There was no forced entry into the home, and nothing appeared to have been stolen. It seemed as though the only person who could have had access to Carolyn was Richard himself. And yet, there was no clear motive. Richard had no criminal history. He wasn't involved in any affairs, and there was no apparent financial gain to be had from Carolyn's death. Still, the circumstantial evidence was damning. The police uncovered phone records showing that Richard had made a call to a number that couldn't be traced to anyone they knew, and they found that he had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on Carolyn just months before her death. The case against Richard seemed solid, at least on the surface. But there was one crucial piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. Richard insisted he was innocent. He had no idea who would want to hurt Carolyn, let alone kill her. To those who knew him, it seemed impossible that he could have committed such a crime. But the evidence told a different story. As the investigation continued, Richard's fate seemed sealed. His insistence on his innocence was met with skepticism. He was arrested, charged with the murder of Carolyn Hooper, and sent to trial. What followed was a swift and public conviction, with the jury siding overwhelmingly against him. The case against Richard was largely circumstantial, but in the eyes of the law, it was enough. Richard Hooper was sentenced to life in prison, and the case was closed, at least, that's what everyone thought. But something didn't add up. The more people heard about the case, the more questions emerged. How could someone so devoted to his wife, so seemingly normal, be capable of such a brutal crime? And why, after years of silence, did the truth remain so elusive? What really happened to Carolyn Hooper? And was Richard truly the killer, or was he the victim of a miscarriage of justice? The answers would take years to uncover, and they would come in the most unexpected way. The police investigation into Carolyn Hooper's death unfolded quickly, but with each step, the questions only grew more troubling. Richard, the grieving husband, was at the center of it all. His every move was scrutinized, his words dissected. The town, once filled with sympathy for him, began to turn its eyes with suspicion. The first red flag came with the phone records. The night before Carolyn's body was discovered, Richard had made a call to a number that no one could identify. It wasn't a call to a family member, nor to any friends. It was a call that couldn't be traced, and no one could figure out who had been on the other end of the line. When questioned, Richard couldn't provide an explanation. He said he couldn't remember making the call, but the investigators weren't convinced. Then there was the life insurance policy. Just months before Carolyn's death, Richard had taken out a substantial policy on her life. The payout would have been enough to solve some of his financial struggles. While it wasn't uncommon for people to have life insurance, the timing struck investigators as odd. Could Richard have been planning something more sinister? Was it a simple coincidence, or had he been preparing for something he knew was coming? But perhaps the most damning piece of evidence was the lack of an alibi. Richard claimed he had been at home that night, asleep beside Carolyn, but no one could confirm this. His neighbors hadn't heard anything unusual. His family hadn't seen him leave the house. Richard was alone, with no one to corroborate his story. To the investigators, this absence of an alibi made him all the more suspicious. It left a gaping hole in his defense, one that made it seem increasingly likely that he was the one who had killed Carolyn. As the case progressed, the investigators began to piece together a portrait of Richard Hooper that didn't fit the one the community had known. The devoted husband, the quiet man who seemed so innocent, now appeared to have a hidden side, a man capable of cold calculation. Richard's protests of innocence seemed less convincing with every new piece of evidence that came to light. The more the police dug, the more everything pointed to him. But something still didn't sit right. Why would Richard, a man who seemed so dedicated to his wife, commit such a brutal act? Why was the evidence so circumstantial, so thin? And why, after all these years, did the case seem so unresolved? The investigation dragged on, and with each passing day, the pressure on Richard grew. As time wore on, his defense lawyer pushed harder to find any evidence that could exonerate him. Despite the mounting evidence, there were still lingering doubts. The case went cold, and the town began to move on. People stopped asking questions. Richard was locked away, and the mystery of Carolyn's death seemed to have been solved. Until one fateful day, years later, everything would change. A bombshell would surface, a clue that no one could have predicted, and it would send shockwaves through the entire investigation. Could it be possible that Richard was not guilty after all? Or was this just another twist in a case that seemed doomed to remain unsolved? The truth was about to surface, but not in the way anyone expected. In 1996, Richard Hooper was convicted of murdering his wife, Carolyn, and sentenced to life in prison. Despite his claims of innocence, the circumstantial evidence against him seemed overwhelming. Phone records, a suspicious life insurance policy, and a lack of alibi made him the prime suspect. Richard's world came crashing down as he was taken away from the life he knew, and he was left to face a harsh new reality behind bars. Prison life was grueling. Richard, once a devoted husband and a man with a future, now found himself trapped in a cell, unable to escape the weight of a wrongful conviction. Every day, he fought not just against his imprisonment but against the injustice of being branded a murderer when he knew he was innocent. The emotional toll was immense. Richard struggled with loneliness, the weight of his family's pain, and the ever-present feeling of being trapped in a nightmare. Despite this, he never gave up hope. Richard kept his focus on one thing, that someday, someone would see the truth, and he would be free. His family, too, bore the brunt of the conviction. His mother continued to believe in his innocence, writing him regularly, while his father, heartbroken by the situation, slowly withdrew from visits. But even in the darkest days, Richard held on to the belief that justice could still prevail. Years went by, and the case seemed to fade into the background, but in 2002, a small piece of evidence that had been overlooked surfaced. It wasn't much, but it was enough to reopen the investigation. Could this new lead finally clear Richard's name? For the first time in years, a glimmer of hope appeared. Richard's fight for justice was far from over, but the question remained, would this evidence be enough to overturn his conviction and prove his innocence? In 2002, 6 years after Richard Hooper had been locked away for a crime he insisted he did not commit, a crucial piece of evidence surfaced, a technicality overlooked during the original investigation. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was enough to cast doubt on the case that had once seemed so solid. A small detail, a misstep in the handling of evidence, led to the reopening of the case. Richard's legal team, after years of fighting to have his case re-examined, was finally granted a breakthrough. The new evidence, combined with mounting pressure from legal experts and the discovery of inconsistencies in the original trial, led to the overturning of Richard's conviction. After 6 agonizing years behind bars, Richard was free. The world he once knew, the one where he was a husband and a man with a future, felt distant, like a memory he could never truly grasp. But now, as he stepped out of prison, Richard felt the rush of emotions, joy, relief, and confusion. The first taste of freedom felt surreal. He was no longer a prisoner, but the man who had been branded a killer was still trapped by his past. His family welcomed him back with open arms, but the joy of his release was tinged with the weight of unanswered questions. The mystery of Carolyn's death still loomed large. Was she truly gone? Or had something far darker been at play all along? Richard struggled to rebuild his life, but there was no closure. The case had been closed, but the truth remained out of reach. What had really happened to Carolyn Hooper? Richard's newfound freedom came with the haunting question, could Carolyn still be alive? Had her disappearance been part of something far more complex than anyone could have imagined? As Richard began to process his release, he realized that the hardest part of all might be answering that question, one that would take him back to the very door where the nightmare began. After his release, Richard Hooper knew that the world he had once known was gone. His name, once associated with love and family, was now stained by the label of a murderer. To the outside world, he was a man who had spent years in prison for a crime he claimed he didn't commit. His every move would be scrutinized, his every word questioned. So, he made the decision to disappear, to live under the radar and rebuild his life in quiet solitude. He relocated to a small town far from where the crime had occurred, keeping a low profile. Richard found a modest job, something that allowed him to live day by day without drawing attention. He stayed away from the media, avoiding any interviews or public discussions about his case. It wasn't that he didn't want to speak out, he had spent so many years in prison, fighting to clear his name, but he knew that any attention would only complicate his attempts to rebuild a life that had been shattered by the past. The quiet years passed. Richard kept to himself, trying to forget the nightmare of the trial, the prison, and the questions that still lingered about his wife's death. He made new friends, people who didn't know the details of his past, who saw him for who he was now, a man trying to live a normal life. But no matter how hard he tried to move on, the specter of Carolyn's death never fully left him. Richard still wondered what had truly happened that night. Was he right in his belief that he had been framed? Or had something more sinister occurred that he didn't yet understand? Just as he was beginning to settle into his quiet existence, a knock at his door shattered the fragile peace he had worked so hard to build. It was unexpected. It was out of nowhere. And when Richard opened the door, the person standing there was not who he thought he would see. The face that greeted him was one he had never expected to encounter again, one he never thought he would see. The woman standing before him was Carolyn Hooper. Her eyes met his with a mixture of disbelief and something else, something Richard couldn't place. She was alive. The question that had haunted him for years, the one he'd never dared to ask, now had an answer. Carolyn was standing in front of him, alive, but how could that be? How could the woman he had been convicted of murdering be standing at his door, 10 years after she had vanished without a trace? Richard's world was upended once more. What had happened? Where had she been all these years? And why was she standing there now? Richard stood in the doorway, staring at the woman he had been convicted of murdering, Carolyn Hooper, alive, standing right in front of him. His mind raced, struggling to grasp the impossible. How was this possible? What had happened? Carolyn's voice broke the silence, her words hesitant. "Richard, it's me." His heart skipped. "How? Where have you been? Why didn't you?" "I didn't want any of this," she interrupted softly. "I had no choice but to disappear." Richard was overwhelmed. The trial, the evidence, the years in prison, it had all pointed to her death. But here she was. Alive. She took a deep breath. "I was forced into hiding. For my safety. And yours." Richard was speechless, confusion flooding his mind. "But they found your body, how can you be here?" Carolyn's eyes were filled with regret. "It wasn't me. They made everyone believe I was dead. And I couldn't reach out, Richard. If they knew, they would have killed me." Richard's world felt like it was crumbling. His past, his conviction, all of it had been built on a lie. "Where were you? Why now?" "I thought it was safer to stay away," Carolyn said quietly. "But now, I can't stay silent anymore. The truth is, much darker than you think." Richard's mind swirled with questions, but there was one that stood above the rest. What did this mean for his quest for justice? Was this the beginning of a long-awaited truth, or a new nightmare he couldn't escape? Carolyn took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the room as if gathering the courage to speak the truth. Richard, still reeling from the shock of her appearance, waited in tense silence. Finally, she began to speak, her voice shaky but firm. "After I disappeared, Richard, it wasn't because I wanted to leave. I was forced into it," she explained, her eyes meeting his. "There were people, dangerous people, who made me vanish. They wanted me out of the way, and they were willing to do anything to make sure I stayed gone." Richard listened, still struggling to process. "But, your body, the blood, the evidence, how could they make everyone believe you were dead?" Carolyn's face darkened. "It was easy for them. They staged everything. They planted my body in a remote area, made it look like I was murdered. They even made sure the police found the evidence pointing to you. They knew that if I stayed in hiding and didn't make contact, they could frame you for my death. It was the perfect plan. They were clever." Richard's mind raced. Had he been framed all along? All those years in prison, believing he was guilty of something he didn't do, could it have been a setup from the very beginning? "Why didn't you reach out sooner?" Richard asked, his voice trembling with frustration. "Why didn't you come forward when you could have?" "I couldn't risk it," Carolyn replied, her voice breaking. "If I tried to reach out, they would have killed me. I had no choice but to stay hidden, to let everyone believe I was gone. I thought it was the only way to protect both of us. Richard's mind was swirling. He didn't know whether to feel relieved or enraged. She was telling him she had been alive all this time, but what about everything else? The trial, the evidence, the people who had pushed for his conviction. Was she a victim in all of this, or had she played a role in something far darker than he could ever imagine? The tension in the room was palpable. If Carolyn had been forced into hiding, it raised a lot of questions. Who had made her disappear? And why had they chosen Richard to take the fall for a crime he didn't commit? I still don't understand, Richard said, his voice quieter now. If you weren't dead, if you were alive, why did they frame me? What did they want from me? Carolyn paused, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and sadness. I didn't know it at the time, but I was involved with some dangerous people. People who didn't want to leave any loose ends. They wanted control, Richard. They needed me gone, and they made sure that you would take the blame. But I wasn't the only one they hurt. They're still out there. Richard's heart sank. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Carolyn hadn't just been a victim, she had unknowingly been wrapped up in something far more dangerous than either of them had realized. Was I ever supposed to know the truth? Richard asked, his voice strained. Was I just a pawn in their game? Carolyn's eyes filled with tears. I don't know, Richard. I don't know if they planned for you to be the scapegoat or if they just saw you as a way to cover their tracks. All I know is that they took everything from us, and they made sure I stayed quiet. Richard was left in a whirlwind of emotions. He had spent years fighting for justice, believing that he was wrongfully convicted. But now, the truth was unraveling in front of him, and it was darker than he could have ever imagined. Carolyn's return had not only reopened old wounds, but it also raised more questions than it answered. As the tension grew, the audience would be left wondering, was Carolyn simply a victim of circumstance, or was she somehow involved in the crime all along? Was Richard truly innocent, or had there been a more complex role played by both him and Carolyn in a twisted story that had yet to be fully uncovered? The return of Carolyn sent shockwaves through Richard's life, and the media frenzy that followed made it impossible for him to find peace. Cameras and reporters filled the streets, eager to uncover the truth behind her disappearance. For Richard, the life he'd tried to rebuild after his release was now overshadowed by the past. Legally, the fallout was immense. Richard's case was reopened, but the damage to his reputation was done. While there were talks of compensation for his wrongful conviction, no amount of money could undo the years he'd lost. Carolyn also faced consequences for faking her death, with authorities investigating her disappearance and the people behind it. Though she had been a victim in some ways, the law couldn't ignore the crime she'd committed. Emotionally, Richard was torn. Part of him was relieved to see Carolyn alive, but another part was consumed with anger and confusion. How could she have stayed silent for so long? Why hadn't she reached out? Was she involved in the crime, or was she truly innocent? Though reunited, Richard couldn't shake the questions. What happened to Carolyn in those lost years? Was justice ever truly served, or was there more to the story than they both realized? As the months passed after Carolyn's return, the full truth never truly came to light. Investigations into her disappearance revealed disturbing details, but nothing concrete enough to clear the air completely. Carolyn's story of being forced into hiding, though compelling, never quite added up. Some parts of her account seemed genuine, but others raised even more questions. Richard, meanwhile, struggled with his own feelings of guilt and betrayal. Though he was exonerated and tried to rebuild his life, he couldn't escape the nagging thought that something was being withheld, something he still didn't understand. Was he really the victim here, or had there been more to his relationship with Carolyn than anyone knew? Did he truly deserve to be free, or had he been caught in a far more complicated web of lies and manipulation? The legal system ultimately cleared Richard of all charges, but the scars from his time in prison would never fully heal. The truth about Carolyn's disappearance, and whether he had truly been wronged, remained elusive. Carolyn, too, was left to grapple with the consequences of her actions, facing public scrutiny and the harsh realities of the lies she had lived. In the end, the case left more questions than answers. Was Richard an innocent man, or had he been part of something darker that no one could see? And was Carolyn a victim of circumstance, or had she played a role in the mystery that still lingered around her disappearance? Some people believed Richard had been wronged by a broken system, but others remained skeptical, convinced that the full story was still out there, hidden behind layers of deception, half-truths, and the shadows of a past that neither of them could fully escape. The truth, it seemed, would forever remain uncertain. As we reach the end of this perplexing case, one thing is clear: the truth remains elusive. Was Richard truly the victim of a broken system, or did something darker unfold during those years of mystery? And what about Carolyn? Was she a victim too, or did she play a role in the deception that ruined Richard's life? We may never know for sure, but the questions linger, and the uncertainty surrounding this case is part of what makes it so chilling. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think Richard was truly innocent, or do you believe there's more to the story than we've uncovered? Share your theories in the comments below, your opinion matters. And don't forget, tomorrow we'll bring you another gripping story, one that's bound to keep you up at night. You won't want to miss it. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any of our future investigations. Stay tuned for more true crime stories that will make you question everything.